Jewish and Christian traditions ascribe the first 5 books of the Bible to Moses, a prophet of God who led the Hebrews out of Egypt in the 13th century BC. But many scholars have rejected this tradition, and even doubt if Moses ever existed. Instead, the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch as it's more properly called, must have been written much later and were originally separate sources. They were then compiled at a later point and attributed to a mythical figure called Moses. Allegedly, we are told all the evidence shows the Pentateuch is a late document and could not possibly date back to the time of Moses. But within the scholarly world, some interesting evidence has come forward. Several aspects of the Pentateuch suggest very ancient traditions that could not have developed during later periods of Israel's history. And when we combine all this data, we come away with a powerful cumulative case that the Pentateuch is very ancient, and much of it could date to the very time of Moses. Theories of how the Pentateuch came to its final form are a dime a dozen. There are various documentary, fragmentary, and supplementary hypotheses. Some of them combine elements from these 3 categories, and also various redactional stages have been proposed. But most posit that the earliest sections of the Pentateuch were not written until long after the time of Moses, and then it did not reach its final form until centuries later. Many scholars suggest that there were early texts written in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. At later points, like during the Babylonian exile or after, these texts were edited and then combined to fit together into a single cohesive narrative. Thus, there's no reason to think any figure named Moses had anything to do with the Pentateuch. It came about from a long process that started after he was said to exist. However, there is important evidence that suggests the Pentateuch is much older than you think. First, Geoffrey Morrow and John Bergsma point to other books of the Hebrew Bible that quote or refer to sayings from the Torah, which shows us the sayings already existed in some form. Julius Wellhausen once proposed the Holiness Code, found in Leviticus 17-26, was created late and utilized Ezekiel 40-48. But Benjamin Kilker points out very few scholars still hold to this today. Instead, Reza Levet Cohen demonstrated that Ezekiel was utilizing Deuteronomy in the Holiness Code of Leviticus. This can be seen in how Ezekiel conflates passages from both sections. Essentially, instead of 2 different and later authors utilizing Ezekiel to create the Holiness Code in Deuteronomy, it is a much simpler explanation to posit that Ezekiel utilized the 2 works and wove them together. Michael Loynes came to a similar conclusion. Wherever the direction of dependence could be demonstrated, it went from the Pentateuch to Ezekiel. As David Carr said, "One prominent mark of relative lateness across all 4 of the texts studied here was the tendency to conflate materials found in the disparate parts of the Pentateuch into one location. The only linguistic phenomenon that did seem to make sense as the basis for a criterion is the variation of the criterion of conflation. A text tends to be later than its parallels when it combines linguistic phenomena from the disparate strata of the Pentateuch." Morrow and Bergsma document several examples of how Ezekiel utilized the Pentateuch from Exodus to Deuteronomy. They also highlight that Ezekiel stressed the importance of Zion theology, which is the view that God promised an everlasting covenant with King David and his descendants, and that their royal line would last forever, and that the capital would be at Jerusalem. This was incredibly important to the Jews after the period of King David. So we should ask, if Ezekiel was a source for the Pentateuch, why would its authors utilize Ezekiel but remove any mention of Jerusalem or Zion? It seems far more likely that Ezekiel was utilizing the Pentateuch and combining it with Zion theology. This is an important point that we will come back to. But other prophets also seem to be aware of and utilize the Pentateuch. Jeremiah was also drawing from the 5 books of Moses, as well as other books found in the Hebrew Bible. The book of Isaiah is generally divided into 2 authors, one being early and one being 2nd Isaiah, who wrote later. There is no question that 2nd Isaiah draws from the Pentateuch. Morrow and Bergsma note more scholarship should be done on the topic of 1st Isaiah. But we do see evidence Isaiah utilized the Pentateuch. Key passages of the first part of Isaiah, such as Isaiah 11, clearly draw on Zion theology, Edenic creation imagery, and Exodus traditions. However, work remains to be done to determine if such allusions are to specific texts or simply to commonly known traditions. Isaiah 1:2 also seems to be referring to Deuteronomy 30:19, where heaven and earth are called upon to testify to the breaking of the covenant. Isaiah 24:17 seems to draw language from Genesis 7:11 and 8:2, and 24:5 may allude to the covenant of Genesis 9. The book of Hosea also seems to presume its audience already had a strong familiarity with the history of Israel, but in a way that isn't different from what is presented in the Pentateuch. Derek Bass demonstrated the evidence indicates that Hosea was dependent on numerous passages found in the Pentateuch, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, and not in a form too different than what we have today. To quote, this study concludes that at the time of Hosea's ministry, in the 8th century BC, the Pentateuch and portions of the former prophets existed in a form substantially similar, if not identical, to that which has come down to us at the present time. This conclusion is founded upon Hosea's copious and pervasive quotations and allusions to Israel's scripture throughout his prophecy. An example is seen in how Hosea employs ironic or negative reversals of what we find in Deuteronomy. If Deuteronomy was instead written after Hosea, as well as the other prophets, it is difficult to see why the author would undo Hosea's irony to produce positive oracles. The same methodology of ironic reversal is found in Ezekiel and Jeremiah. It makes more sense the prophets utilized the Torah to make their reversals, rather than a later writer undoing such things to speak of blessings. We also see specific language from priestly texts in Hosea, which suggests dependence. Morrow and Bergsma find similar conclusions regarding other minor prophets, like Micah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, and Malachi. Some of these prophets are post-exilic, but some of them date to the pre-exilic time. Yet the data indicate they were all aware of several passages we find throughout the Pentateuch. This would support the conclusion that much of the Pentateuch existed in some form in the pre-exilic time and before the prophets were writing. But this is only one piece of the puzzle. The Samaritans have their own Pentateuch, that is variations to what we find in the Masoretic texts and the Septuagint. Throughout the Second Temple period, there was hostility between the Jews and Samaritans that often resulted in violence. The Samaritans had a competing site for the Temple of God, which was on Mount Gerizim. A temple was constructed there around 450 BC and was later destroyed by the Jews, then rebuilt and destroyed again around 110 BC. But before this, in the 6th to 4th centuries BC, the Samaritans had more political power. When this reversed, the Jews used their power to destroy the Samaritan temple, driven by the belief there could only be one centralized place of worship. So needless to say, there was clear hostility between the Jews and Samaritans, as well as cultic competition for where the temple of God should be. But this issue has implications for the dating of the Pentateuch. Over the years, many scholars have argued the Pentateuch was written or at least compiled in the later parts of Israel's history to legitimize the Jerusalem temple and its priesthood. But John Bergsma asks, but how likely is it that the Sumerian Yahwistic community, sometime in the 5th century through the 4th centuries BCE, would have discarded their own sacred texts and priestly writings, for surely they would have had some, in order to embrace wholesale a sacred document produced by the smaller, more impoverished, and socially politically weaker Yahwistic community centered around Jerusalem? I submit that this is historically implausible. The Samaritans wouldn't have taken the sacred writings of the Jerusalem cult, and the reverse was just as unlikely, but the Pentateuch was sacred to both groups. But given the hostility between them, it makes no sense to suggest one adopted the other's sacred writings after their schism. Lawrence H. Schiffman notes there is considerable scholarly controversy regarding the date of the Samaritan schism, but the origins of it really trace back to the pre-exilic period, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom, exiled the elites, and brought in foreigners to intermingle with the lower classes and create a mixed population. From this point, the Jews saw themselves as distinct from the Northerners, who were no longer seen as purely descendants of Israel. It is possible the Pentateuch was being developed during this period, and both came to accept it. But it is less surprising as to why both sects came to hold it as sacred, if it already existed prior to the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom. Additionally, it probably would have been organized differently and resulted in distinctly different redactional layers. Instead, although there is variation, what we observe is basically the same structure between the Jewish and Samaritan Pentateuchs. This suggests a form of the Pentateuch existed as it basically does now early on, when the Jews and Samaritans were splitting as distinct people, or prior to this. Related to this is an even more interesting feature of the Pentateuch, which is a lack of Zion theology. As noted, Zion theology is the view that God promised an everlasting covenant with King David and his descendants, that their royal line would last forever, and that the capital would be at Jerusalem. In 2 Samuel 7, we find something interesting. But that same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have now lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. But I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved, with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? The author of 2 Samuel acknowledged that the earlier divine revelations did not require the temple in Jerusalem. This was a new idea whose origins was in the Davidic monarchy. After this point, Jewish texts constantly made appeals to Zion theology. As noted, Ezekiel combined verses from Leviticus and Deuteronomy with Zion theology. Most critical scholars date the composition of the Pentateuch to periods after King David, and its supposed purpose was to prop up the Jerusalem priesthood and the royal house. For example, Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman said, much of the Pentateuch is a late monarchic creation, advocating the ideology and needs of the kingdom of Judah, and as such is intimately connected to the Deuteronomistic history. And we shall side with scholars who agree that the Deuteronomistic history was compiled, in the main in the time of King Josiah, aiming to provide an ideological validation for particular political ambitions and religious reforms. But there is a huge problem with this. There is nothing in the Pentateuch that supports Zion theology, or the cult of Jerusalem. How could the Pentateuch be an ideological promotion of the Jerusalem priesthood and the cult if it says nothing about this? Morrow and Bergsma put this nicely. Why would a priesthood whose theology, faith, commitments, fate, and livelihood had been inextricably bound up with the sacred site of Zion, Jerusalem, and the holy house that stood there, promulgate a sacred document that betrays the founder of their religion, not only not authorizing their sacred site, nor commanding a temple to be built, but actually giving extensive instructions for a small, portable tent shrine, whose dimensions did not correspond to any structure ever built in Jerusalem, and whose location could be shifted arbitrarily. The truth is there is almost nothing in the Pentateuch that could be used to support Zion theology. Genesis lists 9 sites of worship or theophany, but nowhere is Jerusalem explicitly identified as one of them. Amplifying this, it gives more weight to northern sacred locations, which would support the Samaritans' claims. For example, Genesis gives high honor to the northern city of Shechem. It is the first place in Canaan where Abraham worships the Lord. Both he and Jacob built altars there. It is the place that hosts the remains of Joseph, and it is the place where Israel swore loyalty to God in the book of Joshua. This is also the sacred city lying between Mount Ebal and Gerizim, the latter being the place the Samaritans built a temple. Deuteronomy commanded half of the people of Israel to stand on Gerizim to pronounce blessings. If anything, Deuteronomy favors the Samaritan site for a temple. Etienne Nodet said, the Pentateuch, considered as a whole, goes better with Shechem than Jerusalem, as much from the narration as from legislation. Some might object and argue Jerusalem is in the Pentateuch. Abraham went to a place called Salem, where he was blessed by Melchizedek. The binding of Isaac occurred on Mount Moriah, which is where Solomon built the temple. The problem is the Pentateuch never links either of these locations explicitly with Jerusalem. It leaves them ambiguous. which allows for them to be interpreted as northern sites. Antilato noted that Salem could be a variant of Shechem, which we see in Genesis 33:18 of the Septuagint. The name Moriah, which is a hapax, could be a variant of Morah, which was also near Shechem. Oddly enough, Genesis leaves the two strongest candidates for allusions to Jerusalem as ambiguous, and could very well be references to Shechem. If the Pentateuch was a propaganda piece for the Jerusalem priesthood, this would have been an easy fix by making these references explicitly Jerusalem. We don't see that, nor do we see a need to tie them to Jerusalem to confirm the goals and needs of the Jerusalem priesthood. It also does nothing to support the prominence of Judah as the leader of the tribes of Israel. It suggests that role belonged to the descendants of Joseph, which the northern kingdom and the later Samaritans claim descent from. Joseph is the firstborn and favored son of the favored wife, Rachel, who is given divine foresight from God and saves all of Israel from famine. In Joseph, we have a savior figure with divine blessings. Mauro and Bergsma note the tribal blessings of Genesis 49 designate Joseph as a prince over his brothers. Deuteronomy 33 repeats the core elements of this blessing just before Israel enters the Promised Land. It can hardly be overemphasized that the Pentateuch concludes with every expectation that the Joseph tribes will be at the center of the covenantal blessing as sacred history progresses. When we look at Judah, we get a much less honorific profile. He is the fourth son of the less favored wife. His prominence only comes from mishaps of his older three brothers. He is not granted divine foresight. He married a Canaanite who bore evil sons. His descendants came from his Canaanite daughter-in-law Tamar, who tricks Judah into sleeping with her by posing as a prostitute. Mauro and Bergsma say, the implication of Genesis 38 are that the majority of Jews are of half Canaanite ancestry through an immoral union of Judah and his own daughter-in-law. The Mosaic Law explicitly condemns such unions and punishes with death. If the Jerusalem priesthood had felt comfortable redacting the text of the Pentateuch in the late 6th or 5th centuries BCE, Genesis 38 would have been removed. Judah does appear to be a leader of his brothers in later chapters, and has obtained some moral maturity. His father does grant him a leadership role, even calling him royalty. But the text also suggests this was meant to be temporary. It says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him." But scholars note by a slight revocalization, it could be translated as, "until he comes to whom it belongs, until Shiloh comes, or until he comes to Shiloh," which suggests his leadership role would end at a point in the future. Interestingly enough, Moses does not reconfirm the blessing of Jacob on Judah at the end of Deuteronomy, as he does with Joseph. So the Pentateuch ends with every indication the people of Joseph were meant to lead Israel and not Judah. And we see this in the book of Joshua, since Joshua, who is of the tribe of Ephraim, leads the conquest and distributes land allotments to Israel. If someone was going to write a book to argue divine providence confirmed the Temple of Jerusalem and the tribe of Judah, they would have written the book of Jubilees, which is essentially a rewrite of Genesis to Exodus, with Jerusalem as a central aspect of the narrative. Zion is described as a sacred space in the first chapter. It is called the center of the navel of the earth, and it is explicitly designated as the place where Abraham offered up Isaac. The narrative of Judah and Tamar is altered to hide Judah's mistakes and flaws. Ephraim and Manasseh are only mentioned once, and Jacob's blessings over them is admitted. Jubilees also refuses to authorize Bethel as a place of worship. If the Jerusalem cult wanted to write a book supporting their ideological goals, it would have been something like Jubilees. The Pentateuch does barely anything to support the Jerusalem temple or its priests, and it records a lot that hinders their claim that Jerusalem should be the central place of worship. As Ingrid Helm said, "There is nothing Jerusalemite about the Pentateuch as such, and were it not for tradition's assumptions of a biblical Israel, with a common past in which Jerusalem always had priority over against other Yahwistic cult centers in Palestine, no one would suggest that the Pentateuch had an origin in Jerusalem." From this, we can now offer some important inferences. The Pentateuch cannot be a product of the Jerusalem priesthood from the exilic or post-exilic periods. It does nothing to support their ideological goals. There is also no reason to think it is a Judean document that incorporates a few northern Israelite elements. If anything, the opposite would be true, given the amount that confirms the supremacy of the north and the tribe of Ephraim. But we also know the Jews did consider the Pentateuch to be a sacred document that came from Moses, which suggests it could not have been propaganda crafted by the Samaritans and then adopted by the Jews. There would have been no reason for the Jews to accept a document that harmed their goals and came from their opponents. Given the schism between the two groups, and that both considered it a sacred document, an early form of the Pentateuch coming from Israelites from before this split is less surprising. And pre-exilic prophets seem to presuppose this as well. Additionally, it contains no indication of a rivalry between Judah and Joseph. All the brothers are reconciled at the end of Genesis, and Deuteronomy ends with Joseph as the clear leader of Israel, with no contest from Judah. But because of that, it makes no sense to believe that after the rise of Zion theology, the Jerusalem priesthood would adopt, let alone even write, a text that did nothing to support their ideological goals, and even works against them in many ways. If it was a document of the northern kingdom that was later brought south, the southern kingdom likely would not have adopted it without heavy revisions for supporting Zion theology. In fact, the Pentateuch suggests a unified picture of Israel under northern leadership. The only time the Judahites would have accepted this was before the rise of King David. So this all pushes the date of the Pentateuch further back in time, into a period before the rise of David's kingdom and the First Temple. But if all that existed at that time were the sources that were later compiled into the Pentateuch, the Jerusalem priesthood would have redacted much of them to exclude the negative portrait of Judah. They would have added more references to Zion and redacted the prominence of northern locations. We would have ended up with a document more like Jubilees. Surprisingly, all these factors suggest the Pentateuch is a document that predates the Jewish and Samaritan split, the rise of Zion theology, and the monarchy of Judah, and assumes a time when northern leadership would have been accepted by all of Israel, pushing it closer to the time of Moses and Joshua. The Pentateuch seems to be far more ancient than what many have suggested. But beyond the data compiled by Morrow and Bergsma, there are other reasons to date the Pentateuch to the earliest parts of Israel's history. Many scholars have examined the structure of Deuteronomy and have noted it resembles the way a suzerain vassal treaty was written. Thus, it is teaching us that the Lord has taken on Israel as a vassal state. Throughout the ancient world, there were numerous vassal treaties, and their structure and elements would vary across periods. So scholars have debated about which time period Deuteronomy resembles the most, as this would help us obtain a date for its composition. Kenneth Kitchen argued Deuteronomy resembles Hittite treaties from the Late Bronze Age. But scholars like Hans Ulrich Stiemens argue Deuteronomy borrowed from Asar-Haddon's succession treaty, which dates to the Neo-Assyrian period. This would mean Deuteronomy was written after this treaty and could only be as early as the 7th century BC. However, Neil A. Huddleston wrote his dissertation on comparing Deuteronomy to other ancient Near Eastern treaties. After a thorough and detailed analysis, he found that a number of significant differences appear when Deuteronomy is functionally contrasted with the Asar-Haddon materials and its related tradition. He notes there are similarities at times, but there are a host of differences that cannot be overlooked. It is unlikely the author of Deuteronomy was following or even aware of Asar-Haddon's succession treaty or any Neo-Assyrian treaty. Instead, Huddleston notes Deuteronomy has more parallels to treaties from the Middle to Late Bronze Age, especially Hittite treaties. In other words, when Deuteronomy is compared to the extent of the ancient Near Eastern treaties from the early Bronze Age to the Neo-Assyrian period, the evidence favors the idea that the structure of Deuteronomy fits with the Hittite structure from the periods of the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. Of course, it is possible Deuteronomy was being developed over time, and Neo-Assyrian influence did come in at a later point. But even if this were true, the bulk of Deuteronomy still best fits with Bronze Age documents. Blessings are given with curses in the Hittite treaties, but not in the Neo-Assyrian ones. instructions for deposition, and its periodic reading are features found in the Hittite treaties, but not in the Neo-Assyrian material. Promises made by the sovereign to their vassal and affection toward him are found only in the Hittite treaties, and never in the Neo-Assyrian ones. These features are found throughout Deuteronomy, and so it better aligns with the Hittite structure. The bulk of Deuteronomy most closely resembles the inner discourse modeling of the Middle Bronze and Hittite treaty traditions, and least resembles those of the Eblaite and Neo-Assyrian traditions. This conclusion remains valid when similar features from individual texts are included. Nevertheless, Deuteronomy transforms these inner discourse relationships in significant ways, including their literary form, relative positioning and order, and internal functions. None of the treaty elements absent in Deuteronomy significantly diminish its transformed inner discourse treaty structure, for they are implicitly present. In other words, the style and structure of Deuteronomy fits with the time period Moses was said to have lived. Oddly enough, Joshua Berman is able to strengthen this by highlighting the contradictions between Exodus to Numbers and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy retells parts of Israel's history, but rewrites several accounts that contradict the history found in the other books. For example, Numbers 13 says that God ordered spies to be sent into Canaan, but in Deuteronomy 1, Moses told the people to go capture the land, but they protested and proposed to send spies. In Numbers, 10 of the spies offered a bad report, which caused the people to despair. But in Deuteronomy, the spies offer a good report, and the people still despair. In Numbers 14, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces and offered no rebuke of the people's unwillingness to go. In Deuteronomy, Moses rebuked their despair and told them what God had done for them. In Numbers 14, God decided to execute the Israelites, but Moses prayed and interceded for them. So God relented and decreed that Israel would remain in the desert until that rebellious generation died out. In Deuteronomy, only the decree condemning the first generation is mentioned. In Numbers, the people attempt to go into Canaan anyway and are defeated by the Amalekites and Canaanites. But in Deuteronomy, it is the Amorites who defeat them. Berman lists several other places where this happens. The history is similar, but contains contradictions, which on the surface suggests that Deuteronomy is a different source that was later combined with the rest of the Pentateuch. But when we compare this phenomenon to Hittite treaties, we find similar practices. We see similarities in the treaties of how Nikmadu II of Ugarit became a vassal of Hatti. In the first treaty, the enemies of Ugarit assembled troops to attack their territory. Nikmadu II asked for aid from the Hittites, and they came and delivered Ugarit. But in the second text, the enemies attempt to pressure Nikmadu II into joining with them against the Hittites. There was no invasion of Ugarit's territory. These documents were found in the same room in the southern palace at Ugarit and date to the same time period. It is unlikely they were competing traditions from later periods. They were both sent by the king of Hatti to the king of Ugarit, even though they contradict. A similar issue is found in the treaties that recount how Amaru became a vassal of Hatti. In the earlier treaty, the Hittite king praised the Amaru king for resisting pressure from neighboring kings to conspire against the Hittites. The Hittite king rejoiced when Amaru became a vassal. In the later treaty, we get a different story. Amaru defected from the vassalage of Egypt to Hatti. So the later retelling of the history was reworked to align with the present goals of the people involved. It is not that they were intending to rewrite history. Both the older and later copies of the treaties were preserved. The culture of the time allowed authors to rework the history to align with the present goals and threats. As Joshua Berman said, discrepancies between the original treaties and the later ones, I claimed, were evidence of diplomatic signaling, far from erasing the past and deceiving the servant kings. The Hittite kings intended the vassals to note the ways in which the history had been reworked. The changes that the vassal could plainly see for himself were an index of change in the sovereign king's disposition toward him. Sometimes the retold history could be more charitable toward the vassal, as in the difference in tone between the prologues of CTH 4.6 and CTH 4.7. Factual accuracy is not the point of these accounts. Diplomatic signaling is. It seems this was a cultural practice of the Bronze Age. Historical events were recast to fit the needs of the current moment in the vassal relationship. Returning to the example of the rebellious spies, we can notice the Amalekites and Canaanites were changed to Amorites because Israel was getting ready to invade Amorite territory. Israel is given responsibility for the spies because Israel selected those men and should be responsible for them. More importantly, though, this shows us Deuteronomy fits very well with the culture of the Late Bronze Age and how treaties were written. This converges with the data that Morrow and Bergsma collected, suggesting a very early composition for the Pentateuch, and not something that fits with the culture of the Neo-Assyrian or Babylonian periods. Furthermore, Berman notes because of this, Deuteronomy assumes much of the history that was written in the rest of the Pentateuch. It often only briefly mentions events that were covered in more detail in the earlier books. If the author was writing a history divorced from the rest of the Pentateuch, why did he only briefly allude to important events in their history and assume that his readers already knew that history? Deuteronomy seems to expect its audience will already know what the other books of Moses recorded. This fact, combined with the cultural context of the Hittite treaties, suggests that the earlier history was already written down in the first 4 books of Moses. This is backed by the fact that we see literary connections. It should be stressed that the author of Deuteronomy demonstrates that he is familiar not only with the fact that an Exodus occurred, but with the earlier texts that describe that event as well. Deuteronomy 1:30 states, "The Lord your God who goes forth before you," which echoes Exodus 13:21, "and God went before them." In verse 133, Scripture refers to the pillar of fire and pillar of cloud, first mentioned at Exodus 13:21. The Lord hardened Sihon's heart in Deuteronomy 2:30, in language that invokes the hardening of Pharaoh's heart in Exodus 7:3. Deuteronomy 2:25 speaks of nations that will hear of God's might and will tremble and quiver, all terms that appear in a single verse at the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15:14. Benjamin Kilker points out that many of the verses we find in Deuteronomy presuppose passages from Exodus through Numbers, and at times conflate some of them. In various papers, he has demonstrated over and over again that Deuteronomy presupposes the prior law code collections of the Pentateuch. In fact, 53% of the Deuteronomic material is specific to Deuteronomy alone. The rest is based on the other books of Moses, and the core of its legislation is not even the independent material. Additionally, the direction of dependence for more than 2/3 of the borrowed material can only be going in one direction. That is, into Deuteronomy from the other books of Moses. The remaining 1/3 could be argued either way. He says, Deuteronomy's legal hermeneutics can be summarized as follows. The hermeneutical principle of legal innovation in Deuteronomy is not subversion, but tradition. The conclusion seems legitimate that the laws in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers were available more or less in their present form when the Deuteronomic law was composed, and that they had a quasi-canonical status. Additionally, he notes there's no reason to think Deuteronomy was written to compete with the rest of the Pentateuch. The present study is that the Deuteronomic law has no subversive intentions against the older laws at all. Rather, it is always complementary. Often special cases and special provisions are commanded, which serve to explain existing older laws, or to show in which sense they have been applied. Kenneth Kitchen has also pointed out the covenant formulated from Exodus 20 to Leviticus 26 also follows the Hittite treaty formula. It belongs squarely within 1400 to 1200 and at no other date. The impartial and very extensive evidence, 30 Hittite-inspired documents and versions, sets this matter beyond any further dispute. It is not my creation. It is inherent in the mass of original documents themselves and cannot be gainsaid, if the brute facts are to be respected. Victor Hamilton pointed out that some of the laws of the Pentateuch demonstrated almost word-for-word correspondence with some of the legal works from the 2nd millennium BC, suggesting a template existed for these types of documents. Brevard Child said, "More than half of the Covenant Code's provisions have some parallel in one or more of the cuneiform codes, whether in the form of the same problem addressed or distinctions applied, a similar rule, or an identical rule." The evidence shows that the legal structures of the Pentateuch follow closely with the Bronze Age Hittite treaties, and not the later Neo-Assyrian texts. This suggests the Pentateuch corresponds with an earlier culture that existed during the time of Moses. As the Hittiteologist Harry Hofner said, "Even if some of the many proposals are less convincing, there remain far too many points of similarity, especially in legal, ritual, and cult matters, between Hittite culture and the Bible, for us to dismiss them as coincidental or accidental. Moreover, some cannot be attributed to the late First Millennium intermediary. So we must take seriously the possibility of a channel of cultural influence in the late Second and early First Millennium that allowed influences from Anatolia to be felt in Palestine." Another interesting fact is highlighted by the scholar Sandra R. Richter. Deuteronomy often speaks of the place in which the Lord your God will choose to cause his name to dwell. The scholarly debate around the meaning has gone on for years, but by comparing this to phrases found in other ancient Near Eastern inscriptions and texts, Richter was able to demonstrate the phrase is a lone adaptation borrowed from an ancient Akkadian idiom and refers to when a king would capture new territory and claim it as his own. We can find parallels to this biblical idiom in the Amarna letters. The most ancient form of this idiom appears in Deuteronomy 6 times, and more often than any other book of the Hebrew Bible. She notes Deuteronomy uses a few instances of a later form of the phrase, which she attributes to interpolations. But Deuteronomy most often uses the ancient idiom to claim that the Lord, as the king over Israel, will cause his name to dwell in the land, which means he will claim ownership over it. But she goes on to say, as is broadly accepted, the section of Deuteronomy, in which the idiom appears in the oldest portion of the book, I would argue that it significantly antedates Josiah's reforms. It is also accepted that the old law emerges from non-Judahite circles. Hence, in determining the source, we are left with a non-Judahite, perhaps a northerner, familiar with the Akkadian language, whose narrative ambition was to communicate the statutes and judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land of the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days that you live upon the land. Richter also notes Deuteronomy identifies the place in Canaan where God will cause his name to dwell, and where Israel can build an altar to him, which the text says will be on Mount Ebal. Deuteronomy 27 provides instructions for building the cultic site there. What is interesting is after Joshua, we see no mention of Ebal being the central place of worship. Since it was a northern site, it was not sacred for the kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel and the later Samaritans did not utilize it either. Richter says, as a result, most have concluded that the Ebal tradition is quite ancient and odd. The only time Ebal was used as a cultic site was at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. A small site was discovered there by the archaeologist Adam Zertal, and most scholars now believe it is a cultic site. But it was abandoned around 1140 BC. Since Deuteronomy identifies the central place of worship for the Lord to be on Mount Ebal, this would suggest it fits with the period when there was a cultic site on that mountain, and not later times when the cultic site was transferred elsewhere. Deuteronomy contains yet another ancient tradition that fits with the earliest parts of Israel's history, and does not know about later cultic sites. This also suggests Deuteronomy was written early and when the authors had an interest in promoting the Ebal site. Beyond this, we can find more evidence the Pentateuch fits with the time of Moses. Richard Hess finds evidence of early Israelite cultic practices. The biblical feast of Leviticus 23 most align with the cultic festivals of the city of Emer, which reached its peak in influence from 1400 to 1200 BC. Whatever the dating of the final form of Leviticus 23, as we now have it, and whatever concerns may have shaped it over time, this multi-level collection of similarities in form and content between Emer 446 and Leviticus 23 demonstrate a heritage of the cultic calendar and rituals of Leviticus that predates the first millennium BC. Indeed, this type of text and some of its special days, with their rituals, have a heritage that reaches back to the late Bronze Age. Benjamin Noonan notes the Pentateuch borrows a significant amount of Egyptian loanwords, and more so than what we see from other texts throughout Canaan. But the type of loanwords we find in the Pentateuch fit most with the time of the Middle to Late Bronze Age, which suggests that when this linguistic borrowing was going on, it was happening at an early time. James Hoffmeyer and Richard Hess note the names in the Pentateuch better align with the names we see from the 2nd millennium BC. The Song of the Sea, found in Exodus 15, which many scholars consider to be the oldest biblical text, most aligns with the style of the Kadesh inscription from the 13th century BC. The way Israel arranged as a camp fits with the style of Ramesses II, and not how the later Neo-Assyrian armies encamped. We've explored all these data points and more in our series Exodus Rediscovered, which argues for the historical reliability of the Exodus account. But no matter how we look at it, the evidence presented here suggests the Pentateuch was being put together early on. But adding to this, the Pentateuch displays a high amount of unity, which suggests it functioned as a single narrative, not something that is a patchwork of different sources. In another series, we heavily criticize the idea the Pentateuch is a collection of different sources. But also throughout that series, we demonstrated it contained a high amount of unity that cannot be divided into multiple sources. For example, Gary Rensburg demonstrated there is exquisite unity within the book of Genesis. It is comprised of the primeval history, which is 2 repeated sequences, and then followed by 3 cycles for 3 of the patriarchs with connecting material. This type of unity is unlikely to have come about from the work of different sources that were wove together. The book of Exodus has been shown to have a lot of internal unity as well. Most of it is unlikely to be a patchwork of multiple sources. Attempts to break up the books of Moses into different sources results in all sorts of problems, and the text functions well as a unified narrative. Now, this is not to say we're suggesting the entire Pentateuch as it is was fully authored by Moses in the late Bronze Age, nor are we arguing it lacks evidence of redactions and later changes. Rensburg makes some interesting points that some of the verses of Genesis actually fit with the time of David and Solomon. Some of his arguments are less convincing, but some are too strong to overlook. The most obvious one is Genesis 36:31, which lists the kings of Edom and says, "These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites." Even Kenneth Kitchen acknowledges this verse dates to the time when there were kings in Israel. Genesis 15:18 seems to speak of the borders of Solomon's kingdom, and Genesis 14:14 mentions the land of Dan, which wasn't called that until the time of the Judges. We can also agree passages in Numbers and Deuteronomy were added after Moses, like the account of his own death and the opening lines in Deuteronomy, which state this is what Moses said beyond the Jordan. These lines imply they were written after Israel already crossed the Jordan River to claim the land of Canaan. So if we had to suggest a hypothesis for how it formed, we'd speculate that an early form of the Pentateuch existed under Moses, which was then minimally supplemented and reached its final form just before or during the time of the United Monarchy of Israel. This is hardly an issue, since as we've pointed out in another video, texts were updated over time, so later audiences could understand them as languages evolved. We expect that the Pentateuch was updated over time as the Hebrew language evolved. When this happened, it could have been supplemented with minimal commentary for later readers. To make a comparison, the book of Jeremiah as found in the Masoretic text is arranged differently and is 1/7 shorter than what we find in the Greek Septuagint. It is likely a later scribe added commentary to the book to better help the Jews of his time understand it. We would expect something like this happen over the centuries with the Pentateuch. After all, there is clear variation between the Masoretic, Samaritan version, and the Septuagint. This type of variation would result naturally from scribes and trade-ins adjusting the text to deal with the evolving culture and language. But we should also note there's no sufficient reason to think they drastically altered the text or modified its theology. Additionally, we cannot prove from this data that Moses is the author of most of the Pentateuch. But given the reliability of the traditions, which we've covered here and in other videos, there are good reasons to think that a figure, like the biblical Moses, had a hand early in the formation of the Pentateuch. He would have been someone who was educated and would have had knowledge of the time to craft an original corpus, or at least core traditions that scribes later wrote down, as Kenneth Kitchen noted. The Pentateuch could not possibly have been reinvented, even in the 14th, 13th centuries, by a runaway rabble of brick-making slaves, under some uncouth leader, no more educated than themselves. In short, to explain what exists in our Hebrew documents, we need a Hebrew leader who had experience of life at the Egyptian court, mainly in the East Delta, hence at P. Ramesses, including knowledge of treaty-type documents and their format, as well as of traditional Semitic legal, social usage, more familiar to his own folk. In other words, somebody distressingly like that old hero of biblical tradition, Moses, is badly needed at this point to make sense of the situation as we have it. Morrow and Bergsma say, who better to take the traditions of Israel, oral and or perhaps written, and weave them together into Genesis than someone in Moses' position as head of the people liberating them from Egypt? It would explain why so much of Genesis clearly prepares for the Exodus event. It would also explain the reason for so much material being shaped by priestly concerns. Not only Genesis 1, which source critics identify as coming from P, but also Genesis 2-3, depicting the Garden of Eden as a sort of holy of holies, and Adam as a priest. Moses was a Levite and the younger brother to the first high priest of Israel. Moses would be the most likely candidate from that time to be responsible for such a divine project as the Torah. Of course, it is impossible to prove Moses is behind the Pentateuch, but regardless, we still have evidence a large percentage of it dates back to the time when Moses was said to have lived. Other books of the Hebrew Bible presuppose its existence. It is less surprising if a version existed before the Samaritan-Jewish split. The Pentateuch lacks Zion theology, which would not have happened if it was written during or after the time of David. It lacks any reference to the temple in Jerusalem being the central cultic site. And it most aligns with the time when northern leadership was the norm, and even accepted by the Judahites. It aligns with the style of Hittite treaties from the late Bronze Age. Deuteronomy frequently uses a loan adaptation borrowed from an ancient Akkadian idiom that was rare in later texts, and it fits with the time period when the central cultic site was on Mount Ebal. The biblical feasts fit with an early culture. The Egyptian loanwords in it align with an early period, as do the names, customs, and practices. And there's a lot of unity in the Pentateuch, which suggests there was an original corpus that was minimally updated over time to deal with cultural shifts and evolving languages. Individually, none of these points would amount to much, but together they form a strong cumulative case. The Pentateuch is quite ancient and much older than most think. Even if the Pentateuch was not written down until after the time of David, this would suggest the scribes were preserving reliable oral traditions and not adjusting them to fit the needs of the later time periods. If anything, the Pentateuch seems to be an extremely reliable document. Now, years ago, when I was working on my Genesis 1-11 series, I assumed much of Genesis dated to the time of the Babylonian exile, because that was what the scholar Michael Heiser argued for. Later, when I was researching the documentary hypothesis, I kept encountering data that suggested the Pentateuch was very ancient. I bring this up because I know many will accuse me of holding to an early date because of biases. But even if that is true, the conclusion was arrived solely by relying on the data. And we did this from multiple independent pieces of evidence, which confirms the Torah of Moses is an early work that likely began during the time of Moses. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.